Okay, hello everyone. Welcome back to our class, Ethics, Science and Social Responsibility. And we have been discussing about genetic enhancement. And today we'll keep talking about genetic enhancement, but today we will talk about a counter-argument that we didn't cover before. So let me remind you what genetic enhancement is, what we're talking about when we talk about genetic enhancement, what were the arguments in favor of it, a couple of them at least, and then come back to today's counter-argument, objection against genetic enhancement. So when we talk about genetic enhancement, first of all, let's remember that until recently, it was not an easy task for scientists. It was not an easy technology. It was not an accessible technology for every scientist, and it was a difficult task for those who could access it. After a technology that's called CRISPR, now it's much more easier for scientists to genetically modify living organisms. And when we talk about CRISPR, we are talking about scientists injecting a protein together with a genetic code accompanying this protein. And in the body that this protein is injected, it seeks for the required gene sequence to alter. It finds the gene sequence, it cuts off the gene sequence, and it replaces it with the new gene sequence that it's programmed to insert there. So this is what we more or less talk about very roughly, very crudely, what we more or less talk about genetic enhancement using CRISPR. So there are two major types of genetic enhancement. One is done on somatic cells, and the other one is done on germ cells. When I'm talking about somatic cells, I'm talking about all sorts of cells in your body except the germ cells. So these somatic cells include hair cells, liver cells, heart cells, eye cells, your tooth cells, or your skin cells, all sorts of cells in the body that are not germ cells. And germ cells include sperm and egg cells, the cells that are competent of transmitting hereditary material to the offspring, and of course for later offsprings from there on. So when you genetically modify the somatic cell of a living organism, you just alter that living organism. You do not alter any other offspring, any further offspring that would stem from that organism. You just alter that. If this is a human being, you just genetically enhance that human being when you genetically enhance their somatic cells. So you can cure diseases by this method, using this technology. You can use this technology to alter the somatic cells of a living organism or a human being, and replace those cells, or replace the genetic material of those cells to cure certain diseases. When you alter, on the other hand, the germ cells of a living organism, you do not make the genetic change or directly on that living organism, but you change the genetic material that will be hereditary. That's hereditary. That will be transferred to the offspring of the organism. And when you alter these germ cells, the offspring will be born with the modifying genes in all their somatic and germ cells. So it will be in all their bodies. And it will be further carried to the further generations. So this is what germ cell genetic enhancement is. As you can guess already, the discussion on germ cell genetic enhancement bears more controversy compared to the discussion on somatic cell enhancement. Because when you, as I said, when you enhance somatic cells, you just genetically alter the organism that you operate on, whereas when you change the genetics of a germ cell, you alter the next generation and other generations of offspring that are stemming from that organism. So in that sense, as I said, it bears more controversy, and most of the discussion is focusing on whether we should be altering, whether it should be permissible for us to genetically enhance germ cells or not. Last week, we discussed about Julian Savulescu, who is defending genetic enhancement and trying to address some counter-arguments against it. And today we will talk about Ludwig Siep, who is in favor of limiting genetic enhancement, which is also the title of the article that we read for today. Ludwig Siep has 4 levels of, or 4 stages in his argument. I will just quickly summarize these 4 stages, then go back to some of Savulescu's argument, and come back to Siep to see how Siep is further addressing certain arguments that Savulescu was trying to make. So 4 stages in Siep's argument can be summarized as follows. First step, he says the human body is a basis and point of reference for social rules. Second step, he says, human body serves as the source of values like pleasure, pain, performance, health, and beauty. Third step in his argument, He holds that we should regard the traditional shape of human body as a common heritage. So this is the major argument or major premise in his total argument, rather. And the fourth stage is holding that disputable exceptions for holding the human body as a common heritage need common review rather than individual decisions. So this will be the main structure of Ludwig Siep's objection against genetic enhancement. Before going into details of Siep's argument, let me remind you some of Savulescu's argument, because we have read Savulescu's argument from his article, but we also watched an interview done with Julian Savulescu. So let me just remind you some parts of that interview so that you remember what were some of the arguments that he was making.
Hi. Are you Bas? Yes, I'm Bas. Hi. Nice to meet you. You've stated quite explicitly that humankind, as it is not fit for the future, is unfit, which is a kind of dangerous word.
Well, just to take one example, 1% of the human population are psychopaths.
Mm-hmm.
That means there's around 70 million psychopaths in the world. Now, very soon we'll be able to construct biological weapons in a backyard laboratory and create smallpox in a backyard laboratory. So you don't need to be an expert in maths to realise there's a significant risk there. But on top of that, all of us are limited in various ways. So people are familiar with the failure to reach a consensus or an agreement and enforce it around climate change, or the problems of global poverty and inequality. Humans are naturally selfish, free riders, have limited levels of altruism. So we aren't angels. We aren't some kind of perfect specimen or animal that can solve these problems. That's why the problems continue. And so my idea is that we need to look at human, not just physical or health or cognitive limitations, but also our moral limitations in order to deal with the challenges that rapid advances in technology and globalization create for us.
A lot of people have an instinctive gut reaction against this tinkering on a genetic level with humans.
I think it is a basic bias that humans have in favor of the natural. So if you look at the people who are against enhancing human beings, people like Michael Sandel, the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas, Leon Kass, Francis Fukuyama, all of them accept the use of science to treat disease, but they draw a bright line between disease and enhancing normal human beings. And many people have the same belief that we should leave, that there is something especially good about nature. And this is, I think, really a pre-scientific view of nature and the evolution of human beings. They either believe there's something intrinsically good in nature, or they believe that we're made in the image of God. We're not all born with the same set of capacities. You just have to look around. And I don't think that's good. And I think if we can change it, we should decide to change it for the better. But many people are very happy to accept genetic inequality because it's natural.
And how far would you go? Are there any limits for you?
Yeah, I think this is what the game should be about. It should be about identifying what the ethical limits should be. We shouldn't enhance people. We shouldn't modify them that makes it more likely they will cause harm to other people. We shouldn't change people that creates increased social problems and increased inequality. So one objection people always go, won't this result in Gattaca, a world of the genetic elite and those who are some sort of brave new world? And of course it could. It could if you only make enhancement or genetic selection available to the richest or the most powerful. But if you made it available to those who were the worst off, it would reduce inequality. So how we choose to use this sort of power, I think, is open to us. And for me, I think we can use it to reduce inequality, to enhance the prospects of survival and flourishing over the long term for the human species and the natural world, if that's what you value. But the challenge is to use values to form policy, and not to say natural good, man-made bad.
Okay, so these were some of the arguments that Julian Savulescu was making in favor of genetic enhancement, and we have seen that he's also addressing some of the counter-arguments there. So he was saying that genetic enhancement cannot be objected to in saying that, or while holding that what's natural is good while what's human-made is bad. We cannot hold this argument because it's not consistent. There are already differences in genetic makeup of human beings in the society. And when we look at or accept those, when we look at them as unproblematic or accept those genetic differences, we don't have any reason to hold that genetic enhancement cannot be acceptable because it will create differences among human beings, because we already know that there are already differences. We should need we should have a different type of argument in order to object to the fact that these are not natural. It's not necessary. It's not sufficient. Such argument is not sufficient. So let's see if Siep is giving a further argument in favor of non-naturalness of genetic enhancement. He doesn't directly use this argument that genetic enhancement is not natural, but he gives other arguments that might be related. So first of all, his major argument is that human body is a common heritage. Human body. So what do we mean by common heritage when we talk about common heritage? For instance, Egyptian pyramids are considered to be common heritage of human race, right? So it's not. It doesn't just belong to a couple of people. It doesn't belong to just one nation. It's a common heritage for human beings. Or the Great Wall of China. These are called common human heritages, and they should be protected not only by the people who are living in the country that these monuments exist, but by all humanity. Everybody is responsible for protecting them, and everybody is responsible for not harming them, of course, in the same sense. So in that sense, human body, or at least some attributes of human body, is a common heritage like the Great Wall of China or Egyptian pyramids or the pyramids in Mexico, right? I mean, this is what Siep is saying at least. And he's giving certain arguments or he gives certain premises in favor of this argument. So first premise is that he holds human body is a basis and point of reference for social rules. Let me try to explain further what he means by this. Human body is a point of reference for social rules. So he says that on page 175 in his article, he says that to a large extent, the body is what we are and certainly contains the faculties for everything we consider worth protecting in our social rules. And he goes on saying, enhancing our body and especially our genetic outfit, therefore risks to change the overall shape of the human body. So what might be a danger of changing the overall shape of human body? He doesn't seem to be against changing some particular aspects of our human body for some people, but he thinks that we shouldn't be changing the genetic outfit for the human body in general. He thinks this would be against the idea of equality and diversity that we strongly hold firmly to in our societies. He thinks, or he rather argues, that the small difference between human beings is not that large so as to undermine our concept of equality. Human beings are, of course, have different types of bodies, but those bodies are sufficiently similar to have an understanding of equality, and our understanding of political equality, ethical, moral equality, more or less depends on this understanding of somehow equality of our bodies. This is what Siep is holding. And since nobody is responsible for the genetic differences among each other at the current setup of the society, in which the genetic enhancement is not a commonplace application, commonplace practice, we do not hold anybody responsible for the genetic differences that they have with each other. So, and this is a reason why we can embrace the ideas of diversity and equality together. Since people are not responsible for their genetic differences, we should provide them equal opportunities, and people are people are morally equal because their genetic differences should not count in our calculation or in our evaluation of their moral worth. In that sense, this gives us a tool for embracing the idea of equality, while also accepting that people have diverse genetic makeup, so we can also embrace the idea of diversity due to natural differences in our genetic makeup. He also says different social spheres require different aspects of our disposition, like the spheres of sports, politics, arts, and science require different dispositions of our makeup. So if someone is genetically advantageous in terms of being more successful in sports, they will probably, if they are given the opportunity, be led to doing sports, or maybe we should be giving them opportunity. We should be providing opportunity to people who have better genetic makeup that's more applicable for sports, that makes them more talented, more skillful for succeeding in sports. The same thing holds for instance, an analytic job. If someone is more skillful in analytical thinking, we should give opportunities to those people to excel in mathematics or engineering or other types of jobs in which one can benefit from their analytical skills, so that they can be successful in their lives, and they can be also beneficial to the society. In this sense, all these differences create these different social spheres that we are holding on to in our societies. So we base our social rules, in a sense, on the differences in our genetic makeup of our bodies. And Siep says, in quotes, on page 177, making the individual genetic equipment dependent on wealth or power, even if regulated by the market, would shatter the foundations of this balance. And he adds, but that the differences regarding natural conditions for success in the different social spheres are, as of now, largely due to change, not to power, wealth, or other source of influence possessed by parents or the genetic engineers, make it much more bearable. So the fact that our genetic makeup is not determined by our parents or scientists or the governments makes it more bearable that people have different genetic makeup, because it all depends on chance, factor of chance, luck. And we accept that differences that stem from luck are not our responsibility. We are not responsible. We cannot be blamed if we have some defect in our genetic makeup. Likewise, we cannot be praised just because we have certain genetic advantage, a genetic skill that comes from our DNA. We can be praised for or applauded for what we do with that genetic makeup that gives us advantage. If someone has genetic advantage for playing basketball, if they're really skillful with their hands and legs, and if they're tall enough for playing basketball, we can praise them for working hard and improving their skills for this game, and like being a successful basketball player, for instance. But we cannot applaud them or praise them just for having these skills, because that's just a result of luck. So in that sense, Siep seems to imply that if we allow human societies to permit genetic enhancement in their societies, powerful and wealthy people can benefit from these, can have better access, easier access to these technologies compared to people who are not as wealthy or who are rather worse off. And this will create social inequalities that doesn't seem to depend on luck anymore. I mean, some people are powerful and wealthy, and they will have these technologies under their hands at their reach, and they will genetically enhance themselves and their offspring, and this will create a genetically enhanced elite, in a sense. And this undermines, according to Siep, the social rules that we base our societies on. And in the video that we have just watched, Savulescu was actually trying to give an answer to this problem, but he wasn't giving an elaborated answer. He says, okay, if there's a worry that this will create unfairness in the society, we should directly address that worry and prevent the usage of genetic enhancement, these technologies, only by the rich and wealthy. But he doesn't give details on how this could be maintained, or whether there is hope that this could be maintained successfully. So this is one argument that I would say still lies in the air. It's not cleared away. Let me show you a couple of further arguments from Savulescu. Let me share my Savulescu video again, and let me remind you some of his arguments further. It should be on screen soon. Yes, it's here. Okay, let's work.
My arguments about selecting the best children apply to in vitro fertilization of fish reproduction, where your baby form 10 embryos, and within a year or 2 or 5, you'll be able to test the whole genome of those 10 embryos. Now, what happens today in countries like Holland, United Kingdom, Australia, you can test for major diseases. In my view, that's a good thing. I think we ought to select the embryo which doesn't have a major genetic disorder. Some people disagree with that, and they have arguments. But in addition, you'll be able to select for things like disposition to impulsive criminal behaviour, dispositions to higher cognitive ability. And insofar as that information is there, in my belief, you ought to use it. But in fact, it's illegal. It's illegal if it's not for a disease. And this seems to me completely the wrong way around. You're only going to put in one of those 10 embryos. Why not put the best one in?
But maybe you presuppose perfect parents.
Well, the point is that we already have bad parents. The issue is this going to make people worse parents? And they're completely independent phenomena. And indeed, I think we should be better parents. We should have parenting classes. We should have parental ethics. We should try to encourage people to be better parents. That, to me, doesn't support banning selection decisions around.
Then you have to prevent bad parents from giving them more tools to be even worse than they are.
Well, again, I think the challenge in this area is not to limit people's access to very beneficial science and options. The challenge is to enable them to use that more responsibly. But in the end, if parents have a particular set of values, unless those values are going to cause harm, then they should be free to act on the basis of those. That's what it is to have freedom. So I think that people ought to be choosing children who have higher general cognitive abilities. There's a lot of data that it's better for the child, better for society. Do I think parents should be forced to do that? No, I don't think they should be forced to. That's where I think the correct objection to sort of Nazi eugenics is that it was involuntary and imposed on people according to a state vision of how society should be. But this is precisely what you do when you say people should not be allowed to make certain kinds of choices because we want society to be a certain way. We want there to be this ratio of gay people to straight people, or we want this ratio. And that's just what the Nazis did, except they had a different view of what society should be.
Okay, let me just stop at this point and further discuss some of his arguments again. So as you have seen here, Savulescu holds that, okay, look, we are already picking some embryos rather than other. When, for instance, couples are having in vitro fertilization, when they're having an embryo that's conceived in the lab rather than in the womb, there's already a chance that the scientist can pick one embryo among other 9, right? Or one embryo among the 10 that he or she already has in front of her. So in that sense, the scientist can pick the embryo that has higher cognitive abilities or has less tendency towards violent behavior. If there is this chance already, why not do it? And if the scientist is already given that chance, and it should be morally permissible, why not why not genetically enhance embryos so that they have less tendency for violent behavior or more tendency for more cognitive abilities? His argument seems to be consistent and strong, and he holds on to again, in like his previous arguments, he also on to the fact that we are already making such selections. We have already opportunity to make such selections in a sense, but we are also making such selections when people are picking their spouses. If you want your offspring to be to have tendency to have improved cognitive abilities, you try to find a spouse that already has those abilities functional. Or if you want to have a spouse that has less tendency for violent behavior, you can also seek for such a partner. So if you are already allowing this natural selection, why not give the moral permission to a scientist in an in vitro fertilization clinic, IVF clinic, to pick one embryo among other 10 which has the higher cognitive capacity? Or if you or further, let's carry the argument even one step further, and if you're allowing such a scientist to pick the embryo with higher cognitive abilities, why not allow make it morally permissible for scientists to genetically enhance any embryo for having improved cognitive abilities? Siep has one counter argument against this position that Savulescu is holding. Siep holds that this would lead to a genetic arms race. Like, remember the term arms race in the Cold War? United States of America and United States of Soviet Russia were holding on to arms. They were like having an arms race, and they were just investing in their military so that they would have a stronger military and stronger weapons to destroy their enemy, right, during the Cold War times. And this led to a destruction of both economies. I mean, destruction of one economy and the suffering of the other economy, like a heavy burden on the other economy. But in a sense, it was a heavy burden on both economies. So in that sense, Savulescu thinks that this might relate, Siep argues that such permitting genetic enhancement might lead to an arms race on families or on individuals. People would try to enhance their kids so that they would not be out of competition with other people. If other people enhance their the cognitive abilities of their kids, and if one couple or one individual does not enhance the abilities of their own kid, then their kid would have a slower start in life. So in that sense, they will also improve their kids' genetic abilities, and this would lead to a race in which people are trying to enhance almost all abilities, all skills that their offspring might have. This might lead to an arms race. This is what Siep is holding. And Savulescu, in his article that we read last week, has an argument against this. Savulescu thinks, okay, this could be the case for instance, a skill like height, right? So for a skill like height, if you're trying to make your kid taller, thinking that will give them more advantage in life, and another parent, another couple, or another parent will have to do the same, this might lead to increasing heights of people continuously up to a certain level after which the body will not carry that height anymore. But it will certainly lead to an arms race in terms of height. Maybe that might be the case, except Savulescu, he admits this. But in terms of cognitive abilities, a raise in total or average cognitive ability of human beings, if we try to increase average cognitive ability of human societies, or rather even further than that, if we try to increase cognitive ability for almost everybody in human societies, this will reduce poverty, this will reduce violent crimes, and this will have multiple beneficial advantages. You can see it in Savulescu's article. He has a chart explaining how much benefit human societies can enjoy if we reduce average cognitive abilities, or rather distributed cognitive abilities in human societies. So it's not leading to an arms race in terms of cognitive abilities would benefit the societies overall. It would not be a bad thing according to Savulescu. So he seems to reply to some of Siep's arguments here. Let me go on to Siep's other arguments, but before that, let me just actually go on with Savulescu's video to show you some of other arguments that he was holding on to in defending permissibility of genetic enhancement. The video is on the screen now. Okay, let me just play it.
If I said, to you, look, take this vitamin and your child will be smarter, you take the vitamin. What's the difference between a vitamin and gene therapy? Both of them act on your biology. That's why they have an effect. The difference is two. One is that gene therapy is likely to be more risky, and secondly, it's passed on to the next generation.
Yes.
This is much more radical because you can, in principle, create any level of capacity or modification. With genetic selection, you're just limited by what a couple would naturally produce. All you're doing is selecting something that nature could have produced. Gene therapy, on the other hand, can produce beings which could never naturally exist. So it vastly increases the scope for human modification.
Would you enhance yourself? If
Me?
Yeah?
Sure.
In what way? Maybe that's too personal a question, but...
I think that it would, you know, some people have a high, what's called emotional intelligence. I don't think I have a particularly high emotional intelligence. I've learnt how to identify how people are feeling and to, you know, hope respond appropriately. But for some people, it's very easy, and they feel, you know, other people's emotions and react to those very quickly and intuitively. I don't think that I particularly have that, and I would prefer to understand other people's minds from that emotional perspective better, but I prefer to be smarter. I don't think there's any, I prefer to be more musical. A teacher stood me up in first grade and said, "You're tone deaf," and I never sung after that point. I mean, I would like to be able to appreciate what other people seem to appreciate in music. So I mean, I have lots of limitations that I am.
But and you are a parent?
Yes.
Would you change something about your children?
I don't think I would change things about my children. All of my children, you know, seem
They're perfect already.
perfectly fine to me. I would have selected, if I was having IVF, I would have used all the information available in the selection of the embryo. I didn't. All my children are born naturally. I don't see why all of this information is there, but it's not given to me. I mean, this is, you know, my decision, my child, you know, their future, not the doctors, not the states, not some, you know, individual politician. It's and that information is there, and you're not given it.
How would you think about the responsibility? Because you say parents are responsible. Wouldn't you prefer not to know in some cases, or would you like to have every information and choice you can have?
Well, I think you should step up and take responsibility. Now, of course, you know, people all the time don't take responsibility, and of course you should be free to do that. So if you say, "No, it's too difficult for me, I find it burdensome, I'm just going to let nature throw the dice and I'll take whatever chop," fine, you should be allowed to do that. But what I think you should also be encouraged to do is, you know, given the information, say, "Look, this is, you know, what we know. These are the outcomes that follow these sorts of gene types. Would you like to use that?" Or we would recommend that, you know, these 3 embryos are going to have quite, you know, poor life prospects, and these 3 are going to have better ones. Now you might say, "Well, just pick one randomly." So I think it is burdensome. Unfortunately, you know, we're burdened now with enormous power and responsibility, and most people choose never to accept it. And I think that the bad thing. I don't think ethics should always be patting us on the back saying, "You're doing the right thing, you know, whatever you do, yeah, that's good." I think, you know, it should challenge us, and I think that in many ways we don't even realise that we have responsibility, and when we do, we choose not to take it. Letting nature take its course is a choice now.
Yes.
In the past, it wasn't a choice, but now it's our choice.
Say that.
So, okay, I mean, I will go on with Savulescu video, but before that, let me just summarize this section very quickly. So, apparently, Savulescu is giving further arguments defending the fact that we should definitely enhance our offsprings, genetically enhance our offsprings, because we are already doing it by, I mean, as I said in the previous sections, we are already doing this, and why not do it on a larger scale and with more caution and let's do it more scientifically, in a sense. That's what he's holding on to. So let me go on with the video further.
you know, the so-called gay gene has been discovered, and parents can decide that they don't want to have a homosexual child.
Well, I don't think there's any benefit to being heterosexual or homosexual. I don't think you're choosing a better life if you choose either one. So in this case, I think we should let people make their own choice, allow them to be free. Of course, if everyone in society was choosing homosexual children and there was no other possibility of having children and this was creating great social problems, that would be a reason to intervene. But we should have a basic...
But the other way around, because normally, let's say Russia, people, you know, they don't have a high opinion of homosexuality, and I'm sure the parents will think, you know, my child will have a rotten life if I allow him to be born or with this gay gene. How would you defend that choice morally?
Well, I think that it's a choice that people have the freedom to make, and it's like sex selection, choosing a male child in a sexist society. The solution to that is not banning sex selection. It's not banning the capacity for people to make those. The proper solution is to get rid of sexism and homophobia and the social institutions and practices that cause people to choose, you know, one sexual orientation or one sex.
Wouldn't be... That's very libertarian, but wouldn't it be just more simple just to ban that kind of choice?
Well, I don't think we should be banning choices and banning people, you know, restricting freedom unless people are harming others. I think this is a very basic, and it's increasingly under threat as certain moralists and certain moral values dictate how we should live. And I think we're giving up too much freedom. I think the only reason to ban or limit freedom is when you're harming someone. So when somebody chooses a heterosexual child in Russia, who are they harming? No one. When somebody chooses to sex select, who are they harming? No one.
Well, someone may say you're harming a kind of diversity in society that has been there from the beginning of times. Even the people didn't acknowledge it, but you know, you can also create a kind of equalized world in which everybody thinks is about the same, and there are no criminals, or not as many as there were, and it's all for the good, but in the good in a sense that it's for one thing quite boring, and also maybe quite how would you say, not very challenging anymore.
Well, I think if diversity is a good thing, then it should be encouraged, and we should, you know, do things which encourage diversity, but we shouldn't be limiting people's choice. Somebody decides how society should be constructed or what level of diversity, and they say, oh, so we're going to regulate your choices on the basis of our idea of what the best kind of diversity is. I have sympathy with preventing choices when they cause significant social harm. So I don't think people should be free to choose an embryo with a disposition to psychopathy. I think that's a choice we shouldn't, because that will result in direct harm to other people. Hair colour, eye colour, it's not the state's business to be intervening at that level, and nor even the sex of the child, unless there is a significant gender bias, a gender inequality in the sex ratio in society. If you've got 6 males to 5 females, as is the case in some parts of India and China, that's a reason to restrict freedom. But, you know, in Holland, a few people choosing to have a boy because they've got 2 girls, or a girl because they've got 2 boys, is not the sort of thing we should be, you know, preventing through the force of the law because we have some idea about how Dutch society should be. You can massively...
Okay, before going further in the video, let me make a couple of remarks here. As we have seen, Savulescu is a big fan of choices and freedom. And he says that we should be embracing those choices that people are making. We should be defending people's freedoms unless those freedoms are not harming anybody else. Then until to the point that those freedoms are harming anybody else, we should be defending freedoms, and we shouldn't be intervening in people's choices of how they enhance or pick their offspring. So Siep's argument, so we are now getting into the major points of Siep's argument regarding the human body being the common heritage. Siep's argument might be an answer to this this position that Savulescu is holding. Let's see if it is or it's not a counter argument to Savulescu. Again, what Savulescu defending, he's saying that we do not have a right to interfere in people's choices of genetically enhancing their children or choosing genetic attributes, certain genetic attributes of children, as long as such a genetic attribute will not harm any other people. So, excuse me. So, we shouldn't be letting people to pick embryos that have a tendency for psychopathy, for instance. That should be legally banned. We shouldn't let people do this because we know that, I mean, when somebody's having a tendency for psychopathy or for the same regard having a tendency for violent behavior, it will be harmful to other people. At least there's a high probability that it will be harmful to other people. So we shouldn't let people to pick such genes on purpose or willingly pick such genes. But other than that, if a gene that they pick, like having a taller offspring or having a tendency for being taller or having a tendency for having improved cognitive skills, should not be interfered with, because such skills apparently do not seem to harm anybody else in society. In that sense, Siep might have an argument of a different sort. So let's come to the major points in Siep's argument. Siep might say that, or actually he's holding that, okay, maybe increasing the cognitive capacities or having increasing a gene so that people have tendency for improved cognitive capacities do not seem to directly harm anybody else, but it harms the common heritage. Human body as the common heritage. So let's understand the details of his argument. And he particularly talks about this idea of degrees of autonomy versus paternalism. On the one hand, we have quite autonomous choices, like highly autonomous choices rather, and on the other hand, we would have highly paternalistic choices, or highly paternalistic rather interventions on people's choices. So Savulescu says we should permit people's autonomous choices whenever such choices are not, as long as those choices are not, do not seem harmful to other people. And we should be paternalistic on choices when people are seemingly having a choice that might have an impact on other people that's harmful, like choosing a gene of psychopathy for their children. Siep says, okay, that distinction might not be such easy to make. So he says, for instance, one example that he gives for an enhancement that's in line with autonomy would be genetic enhancement of an adult athlete for enhanced performance in sports. Siep thinks such an enhancement might be permissible because that seems to be in line with autonomy. But when you get one step further than autonomy, for instance, this is a quote from Siep's article on page 179, he says, genetic mutations responsible for serious hereditary ills and perhaps the normal genetic disposition of aging process might be a step further than autonomy. And he says we are now stepping into the gray area. If we, for instance, stop genetic dispositions for aging, or stop certain genes that are responsible for serious hereditary ills, sicknesses, we are now starting to change common heritage, human body as the common heritage. At the paternalistic end of the scale, we would have the genetic engineering of children according to personal wishes of their parents, or still more Ethiopian, those of other people like state officials, etc. So at the beginning, I said genetic enhancement of an adult athlete for enhanced performance is on the autonomy level, is on the autonomy end of the scale. But Siep is saying that, okay, one can maybe alter their own genes. An adult person can choose to alter their own genes. This would be in line with freedom and freedom of choice and autonomy. But if you're changing the genes of your child, or if the state officials are interfering in such a choice, that this would be on the paternalistic level, and then we would at least need a discussion on whether we should permit such interference or not. And he actually goes further than saying this. He says even when the enhancement stems from an autonomous choice of adults, there's still a social element to it. And he says he holds some people, particularly the rich and powerful, might have easier access to such technologies and further widen the fairness gap in the society. And we have already talked about this argument. But he has further arguments about the human body as common heritage. Siep holds that there's a traditional shape of the human body. And in quotes, he says, considering the value we attribute to human heritage in the arts or historical buildings and the natural heritage of landscapes and species, should we not attribute at least similar value to the traditional shape of the human body as well? He goes further and says, the trust in other people's behavior is to a large degree grounded in the familiarity with their bodily appearance. Later in the article, he holds, despite all the difficulties involved in defining health, we have to respect the border between health and enhancement. Only very serious and avoidable deficits regarding health can justifiably appeal to objective interests of future persons. And he thinks, is already clear somehow, he thinks that the understanding of human body creates some sort of trust among people. We take other people's capacities, talents, based on their natural body types, what Siep wants to call natural body types. And he wants to say that this natural body type is not only a statistical distribution of body types in the society, this is more or less evolutionary and physiological, functional aspects of, depends on such aspects of the body. Whatever we are seeing naturally in our societies make up our expectations of other people's bodies, and this creates certain element of trust that we have on other people. We do not expect someone that we meet on the street to jump 3 meters high and like harm us or do something extraordinary. We built our societies on such expectations. For instance, this is not Siep's example. This crazy example is mine. But I mean, he tries to imply such arguments. We have our expectations on other people's behaviors based on their natural body type, which is a common heritage for human societies. Nevertheless, there should be a limit to how many and which diseases and illnesses the body as common heritage should preserve. It would be too much value conservatism if we were to require the protection of the heritage of human body, including all the diseases we would otherwise be able to safely eliminate. So this was a quote from Siep's article on page 182. He accepts that, he concedes to the argument that we should be eliminating certain genetic diseases, of course, but he doesn't think that we should be giving such choices to individuals. These choices should be based on common discussions. We should be like publicly, we should have a public discussion on what sort of conditions hold as hereditary diseases that should be eliminated from our genes and should not be counted as such sicknesses. He believes that there's always the risk of eliminating good traits of the human body while trying to get rid of some genetic diseases, so we should be very careful about it. He gives one example. He says Germany prohibits abortion for the purpose of sparing a child of unbearable bodily handicaps, and permitting such an act would be imposing on unborn child an idea of a life worth living, and we should be doing this according to Siep. It can be permissible to treat severe cases of hereditary diseases by germline genetic therapy, but not others. So Siep's argument allows for certain genetic improvements, and those improvements are more or less limited to those which are responsible for genetic sicknesses that we carry on to our offsprings. But other than that, he's not in favor of giving people permission to alter, for instance, the height of their children, the eye color of their children, or even the cognitive capacities of their children, just because it's their personal choice. So Siep would be against Savulescu's personal freedom argument here. Let's watch Savulescu video a bit further and see if Siep's argument has anything relevant to further arguments that Savulescu is making here. So the video will be on the screen in a second.
Massively increase this selection for genes because but you only produce 10 or 20 embryos. So actually you can only choose for a very small number of genes. If you have 100,000 embryos, then you can start to make selections over many, many more different genes. So you could be having not just the child that naturally you'd produce, but one that you would be very
likely, except over many hundreds of lifetimes to produce. So this means that you could have quite significantly genetically advantaged children. Importantly, natural reproduction is pretty bad. It's ineffective and unsafe. Only about 1 in 5 embryos produced naturally go on to produce a baby. The rest die out very early on after conception because of major abnormalities. And secondly, of those that are born, 5% of them are abnormal. 5% of babies are abnormal. So natural reproduction is inefficient and unsafe. It won't be very long before artificial reproduction has much better figures than natural reproduction. So the move to a much greater use of artificial reproduction is inevitable just because natural reproduction is so bad.
Another objection would be that people would be completely calculating about everything and it would take the surprise out of life itself.
Okay, I'm gonna give you a pearl now. We calculate when we choose our mate. And in fact, that's one of the deepest sort of eugenic selections that human beings make. They choose their mate according partly to the sort of offspring that they want to have. Now, maybe that's a bad thing. I once had this case of what I call the reproduction lottery. You might think that we're too calculating. So what we should all do is have children by IVF. And those embryos go into a big pool. And we always get somebody else's embryo. So we never have our own genetically related child. This would equalise the sort of correlation between genetic privilege and social privilege, and would make us less calculating because we wouldn't be able to calculate what our children were going to be like at all. Maybe that's a better world than maybe we're too calculating at the moment. I don't think we are. I think more calculatingness could be a good thing. But we can't just assume that what we have now is somehow matched to our values and what we ought to be aiming at, because it's just the production of brute evolution.
You seem to be quite optimistic about how humans will handle all these new technologies.
No, I'm very pessimistic.
Oh,
So I think it's all going to end badly.
Oh, I see.
But I think the only hope that we have is to try to avoid that.
So this is
and
our last chance.
Business as usual will end up quite bad.
Okay.
So I think I'm not at all optimistic, but I think the only thing we have going for us is not our enormous cognitive capacity that's generated our science. In many ways, could be our undoing. What we have going for us is the capacity to decide between good and bad. And we have to take that a lot more seriously than we have so far, because that's the only thing that's going to get us out of this dilemma. Do I think that we will get out of it? No, I don't. But I don't think leaving it to the market is going to solve the problem, which is what people basically think.
Okay, these were some further arguments that Savulescu is making. One argument there was particularly interesting, I believe, and it's the argument where he was saying, okay, look, some people are arguing against permissibility of genetic enhancement, holding that this would make people more calculating. People just will calculate what kind of eye color their babies should have, what kind of hair color, what kind of skin color, fair skin or darker skin, or what kind of height they should have. Should they have a tendency for improved cognitive abilities? And this is not acceptable. Some people argue against Savulescu holding these arguments. He says, okay, we are already doing such calculations. We are already picking our spouses, looking at their appearance or their skills, their cognitive skills or other skills, their tendency for violence, and we are already making that sort of selections. If people are advocating for less calculating, for us being less calculated when we are picking offsprings, why don't we just have a lottery for distribution of babies? Maybe all babies should be made in laboratories, and people should be just delivered babies by lottery, and they in that case they would not be calculating anything about their babies, because it will be all end up by lottery. Since people would not accept this absurd result, people are not against calculation. They are just probably fearful of the consequences that genetic enhancement might have, not because people are more calculating when they argue in favor of genetic enhancement. So I think this is a very good argument, and he's saying that the argument holding that we are too calculating does not function. We might have further arguments, and at the end of this video, he was accepting that he's fearful of the technologies, and he's also accepting, conceding in a sense that powerful and wealthy in a sense, he doesn't say this, but probably that's what implied in his argument, might use these technologies for their benefit and might create some unacceptable results. This is not direct answer to what Siep is holding, because Siep is saying that, Ludwig Siep is holding that human body is a common heritage, and in order to permit altering human body genetically, we should have a common discussion. It shouldn't be left to private choices, personal choices. In this particular argument, maybe Savulescu and Siep might agree. I think there's some area of space of agreement between these two thinkers, because Savulescu is also scared or worried about the malusage of or usage of genetic enhancement for not so good purposes, right? That's what we saw at the end of the video. And Siep is somehow worried for that as well, for different reasons. So how would Savulescu argue against, or would he agree in favor of the genetic limiting genetic enhancement, holding that human body is a common heritage? So I mean, it's up to debate actually, and I will not give a direct answer to you guys. But let me just remind you as the final remark of this class, remind you the positions. So Savulescu on the one hand is holding that you cannot hold on to many of the arguments that you are making today to be against genetic enhancement. There are multiple arguments that we discussed last week and today against genetic enhancement, and you cannot hold on to these arguments in order to argue against genetic enhancement, either because we are already doing such things by naturally selecting our spouses or for some other reasons. Siep, on the other hand, is giving a new argument. He's saying that, look, maybe we cannot argue against genetic enhancement holding on to all these traditional arguments, but there's one further argument that I will give, and that depends on human body as cultural heritage. Human body, as we know it, makes up the foundation of many valuations that we are using today about beauty, about pain, about many other things that we are already using in our societies. And many social rules are already dependent on how we take human body to be, or the capacities of the natural, in a sense, human body, what we take natural human body to be. We also base many social rules on such a perception. If we give permission to individuals for enhancing their offspring, the understanding of human body will change, and this change will be out of control. There will not be a public debate about it, and there will not be a checkup on such changes. At that point, Savulescu might not directly agree with Siep, because Savulescu is all in favor of giving freedom to human beings for picking the genetic traits of their offsprings, as long as such genetic changes, enhancement, will not have a tendency to harm other people. Siep, on the other hand, says that, okay, there might be different sorts of harm to other people. You can harm other people directly, or you can harm other people by, for instance, altering the way they have the trust in other human beings, or they have expectations from other human beings. If you change human body, genetically enhance human body, or open the way for it, you will change people's expectations from each other, and you will change the way people can trust on each other, because many of these ideas of trust, or many of these ideas about pain and beauty, depend on traditional human body. As long as you do not have this change, you do not have a public discussion on how we should be changing human body, this shouldn't be permissible. So on that respect, they are clearly not agreeing. And this remark, I think we can end today's class on limiting genetic enhancement. We have talked about Siep's arguments on why we should be limiting genetic enhancement. I reminded you some of the arguments that Savulescu was giving, and tried to put these authors or these philosophers in a dialogue with each other. And this ends today's class. Thank you for watching this recording.